Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. My name is Rob Ulmschneider. I'm the Director of Business Intelligence Solutions at Tilix. And at Tilix, we help companies achieve new levels of growth through culture, strategy, and execution. And a big part of that is data and analytics and intelligence. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was actually supposed to present at Live Real Venture Cafe. And actually the night before, Wednesday before, I was going through my talk when I got the word that it was going to be postponed until this week. And so that was 15 days ago, but I feel like it was actually months ago with everything that's happened in the meantime. So when I look at everything that happens since, in light of our current reality, which I just feel is impossible to ignore, I want to shift the conversation a bit. I was going to talk about building a data-driven culture. It's a topic that I talk about a lot, that I've written about. But tonight, what I want to talk about are some ways that data can help you navigate through times of uncertainty, just like where we find ourselves today. And some of these concepts are actually part of the recipe for a strong data-driven culture. It's just that I feel like there's a little bit more of a sense of urgency right now. So Avi, do you mind posting our poll question? Avi was really eager to try out Zoom's polling feature. So I gave him a question to put out there, and he'll post that now. So in talking to business leaders in the last couple of weeks, there are some common concerns that I've heard from the effects of the pandemic that we're dealing with right now. And of course, I don't know if the poll's up, but okay, there we go. Now, I know that obviously these take a backseat to the tremendous public health concern, but I'm interested in what your concerns are, just thinking about your own business. And I think the poll should allow you to pick more than one of those if you wish. Now, while we get some responses in, just to bring this back to the topic, there are some data-centric approaches that can help you tackle some of these issues in the short term. And for some of these issues, we've already seen people come up with really innovative and clever remedies. And in those cases, what we want to do is we want to collect data to look and measure the efficacy of those solutions. So I'm going to talk about different ways that having a data-driven mindset can play a role in working through those. All right, so looking at the results, a lot of people said reduced demand for products and services, secondary effects from the weakened economy, inability to directly meet with clients and customers. It looks like everybody, there was nothing on this list that didn't resonate with at least one person. So as I go through my talk tonight, I am going to mention some of these things and how we can use data to measure, either to come up with a solution for them or to measure how effectively we're dealing with them. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 5 tips for using data to manage uncertainty. And I'm just going to end the poll, I guess, Avi. And share results. I don't know. I thought that was being shared. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sharing them right now, I believe.
Okay, so folks can see that now. So yeah, what I'm going to give you are 5 tips to use data to manage uncertainty. And one thing you'll notice about the things that I'm going to talk about tonight, these are things that are going to be of little or no monetary cost. This is not the time to really talk about deploying Tableau or building a data warehouse, because those are means to an end. And what we want to do here is to shift our mindset around data, basically. Some of you might be already using data strategically, and if that's the case, because of all the changes we've seen, you might need to rethink your approach. And if you aren't using data right now at all, it's a great time to start. So Margot did a great job talking about all the things that Zoom offers, and so I got clever with my approach here. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is, what we think of data. All right. So, I think this is an evergreen concept that I talk about when talking about data culture is, what does it mean when we say data? A lot of people think of data as numbers, right? It's ones and zeros. It's the stuff in our applications, our phones, our systems, or it's our CRM or our ERP. And if your definition of data is just limited to that, you might not think you have a lot of it, right? You might be tracking some of that stuff in spreadsheets, or in some cases not tracking it at all. But that's not all that data is. If I had to put it in simple terms, data is just facts, right? It's a recording of events or things or attributes about events and things. And those attributes could be numbers or transactions, sure. But it's also about people, what they like, what they don't like, how they interact with you and your organization and your products, who they are, where they want to be going. Basically, data are the nouns of your business. And being data-driven simply means looking at those nouns, looking at the facts, and using them to draw conclusions and make decisions. So when we look at this data, when we look at data this way, you can start to realize that the things that you measure, they really don't need to be complicated. In fact, some of them are very simple. Some of the best metrics are simply just counting stuff, right? People, dollars, sales, clicks, easy things to wrap our heads around. Now, I have a little bit of a controversial view on what can and can't be measured, perhaps. There's a saying, and it's often attributed to Albert Einstein, but it wasn't him that really said it. But the saying goes, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And so I totally agree with the latter half of that statement. I've seen way too much, dozens of graphs and charts and gauges, but no real insight. Just a lot of confusion and noise. But on the other half of the statement, not everything that counts can be counted. I think there's a way to measure almost anything. Now, some things can be measured more precisely than others, and certainly there are some immutable measures where there's no debate on how important and relevant they are. But if you look hard enough, there are many more questions that data can answer than perhaps you realize. And so that brings me to my second point, which is that inputs should count just as much, if not more, than your outputs. So this is another evergreen point that applies even in times that aren't so crazy. I was talking to a business leader just this week, and I asked what he sees as his company's most critical sales KPI. And without hesitation, he said, well, top line revenue. Because if revenue is up, then sales is doing the right thing. And yeah, that does make sense, of course, but what happens when revenue goes down? It's not necessarily a sales problem. So a lot of the traditional KPIs that we're familiar with are lagging indicators, right? They tell you what happened. And that's great to know. That's very important. You want a clear picture of, say, last quarter's results. But the problem is that by the time you see that number, it's too late to do anything about it. You need to be tracking leading indicators in addition to lagging indicators. So these are things that measure behavior that you've determined correlates with your desired outcomes. So let's take churn rate, for example. This is a really important measure if your business is subscriber-based. So if you don't know what churn rate is, basically it's the percentage of customers that you use or lose over a given period of time. So let's say you have a churn rate of 5% per quarter. That implies an average customer lifespan of 5 years. Okay, that's all well and good. But what happens if one quarter your churn rate shoots up to 10%? Well, it's already too late. You've already lost those customers, already too late to do anything about that. And in fact, whatever's causing that might still be a problem, and it's going to affect this quarter's numbers. So, you need to look at a complementary leading metric that serves as sort of this canary in the coal mine. In this case, it would be something that measures customer satisfaction, like a Net Promoter Score. And you can watch that, and when you see when that starts to dip, that's when you know you need to take action and correct course. So why is this distinction between leading and lagging metrics? Why is it so important in times of uncertainty? Well, the fact is this. Right now, you could be doing everything right and seeing negative results, seeing bad outputs, because there's so many different variables in the picture that weren't there a month ago, let alone a year ago when you came up with your KPIs, when you came up with your goals. In times like this, when you have less control over the output, you really need to focus on the inputs, the processes, the activities, to make sure that you're keeping up with those. The outputs, a lot of that might come from your P&L. They're very important, but they're going to be too noisy right now with everything else that's going on and contributing to them. So tip number 3 is in a similar vein, and that's favoring simplicity over precision. So what you see behind me is an illustration of quantum waves and particles, and of course we're talking about uncertainty. So I would be remiss if I didn't invoke Werner Heisenberg, he of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and namesake of the infamous Breaking Bad character. Now, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that the more precisely, when you're dealing with the subatomic particles, the more precisely that you can measure its position, the less confidence you have over its momentum. Basically, you can know where one of these things is going, but not necessarily where it is right now, or vice versa. And I feel like we're at a time where we might not know where we are or where we're going. So it makes it difficult to accurately measure what we could in less tumultuous times. Now, as this relates to data, during times of uncertainty, the best analytical approaches actually usually don't require a high level of precision. So if you're not using data prolifically right now, you actually might be at an advantage here because it's a level playing field. Complex data models are great, but they include a number of variables that rely on assumptions that can be undermined whenever we see massive changes like we have recently. So I'll give you an example from a company that has a very expensive and sophisticated data ecosystem. It's a little mom and pop shop that you might have heard of called Walmart. And a couple of years ago when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, Walmart saw an uptick, a weird, dramatic, and unprecedented uptick in sales of a certain product. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to what it is? I'll give you a hint, it's not toilet paper. So it was actually Pop-Tarts.
Oh.
That's not what I was going to guess.
Like someone gets hot water.
Yes.
Love them some Pop-Tarts. And so when that happened, Walmart's AI basically made a mental note of that. This isn't something, with everything that Walmart sells, an uptick in sales of Pop-Tarts in Houston on just this 1 week really wouldn't have made a dent. But with AI, it can balance all of these variables, and it made a note of that. And the following year, when a hurricane was approaching the Florida coast, Walmart's AI kicked in, which actually their data ecosystem includes meteorological data, if you could believe it or not. And they said, hey, a hurricane's coming to Florida, let's get some Pop-Tarts down there. And it just made that decision. Nobody had to, intervene or anything like that. And what do you know? The Pop-Tarts also sold in Florida as well. So hurricanes aren't exactly generational events like what we're experiencing right now. So we can't rely on old assumptions today. I doubt anyone here has an ecosystem rivaling that of Walmart. But if you're using any sort of advanced analytic approaches, you really need to examine them. These are models that fit really well with past data, but they're going to be less likely to predict the future in times like now where there's rapid change. So, where there was strong correlation a month ago, that correlation might no longer exist. You need to take simple approaches with direct and obvious ties to outcomes. That's really the best path forward right now. Now, the thing about these models is they're often tied to providing an optimal result, right? They just make a decision. No human had to press a button to send Pop-Tarts to Florida. The AI took care of it. And the nature of decision-making is also something that changes in times of uncertainty. So my next step is to start using a robust decision-making approach. So I'd like to cite IEEE's definition of robustness. They're an electrical engineering association, and they define robustness as the degree to which a system or component can function correctly in the presence of invalid inputs or stressful environmental conditions. Now, when you think about how we traditionally make decisions, often data analysts like to visualize the approach as a decision tree. So this is a combination of choices or actions and states and outcomes, and each outcome has a probability and a utility value. And so the optimal decision is the one that's going to produce the highest expected value. So here's an overly simple example. Let's say your company has $10,000 to invest in a product development initiative. There are two options. You can build a brand new product, or you can revamp an existing one. The potential new product has a 50% chance of success, and if it's successful, it's a $40,000. Now, if you go the other way and improve an existing product, guaranteed to be 100% guaranteed success, $15,000 return. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with the scenario, but please forgive, this is just a thought experiment. But the expected value of that first investment is going to be 50% of that 40,000, 20,000. And the other one, because it's guaranteed, 15. So the wise investment, the optimal decision, is that first one, which is riskier. And actually, I mean, the wise investment is to find $10,000 more and do both, because they both have a positive expected value. But like I said, it's a silly example. So when the optimal decision is the riskier one, and we're in a point where uncertainty is high, how confident can you be in the underlying assumptions that we made there, those probabilities and those values? So that's where robust decision-making comes in, which differs from traditional decision-making values in that it doesn't necessarily favor that optimal solution. The goal is to find the most robust option. Now, that may be a little less optimal, but the trade-off is that it's less prone to volatility if the underlying assumptions are incorrect. So don't just look for the highest value option, but you look for the values of all, of all the different options that you have. And you weigh them against one another, you establish multiple views of the future, and essentially you build this framework that guides your decisions as different situations start to unfold. You're still basing the decisions on much of the same underlying data, but you're dealing less in absolutes and more being reactive, which is really what the times call for right now. So going back to our example, it means we really need to dig deeper into all of the components of that. Where did we come up with that 50% probability? Are we sure that that smaller return is actually guaranteed? And our level of confidence in those assumptions are going to guide the path forward. Now, my fifth and final tip is a little more forward-looking, and that's this. We need to look to salvage lessons, some enduring lessons from the situation that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to slide away a little bit. Hopefully you can still hear me on the microphone, because I want you to see this picture behind me. Hopefully it's clear enough. But this is the one-time home bedroom of one Sir Isaac Newton. Okay, back in the year 1666, Newton spent the better part of that year confined to this very bed in self-isolation due to a severe outbreak of the bubonic plague. And Newton used this time working on some of the things that have made him a household name 350 years later. He was doing a lot of his research into gravity. And this is also where he came up with some of the core concepts of modern calculus. Now, there are two things that I think is really poignant about this. First of all, if you remember anything from calculus from high school, a great deal of it has to do with the slope of curves, right? And 3.5 centuries later, we're in a position very similar to where he was. And what have we talked about nonstop for the last week, but the slope of a curve that we want to flatten, right? And the other interesting thing to me is when you think about what calculus is all about, it's the discipline in math that has to deal with change and finding out how one variable changes relative to another. So we're in a time right now of great change. And I don't mean this to be like a look for silver linings or make lemons out of lemonade. This is more about what are we already doing? What are those remedial steps that we're taking right now? And figuring out from those activities, are there lessons that we can learn going forward? Are there things, when things stabilize, and not if, but when, what will we be able to carry from this experience forward to actually make the post-pandemic business world a better place? There are some things that we're doing that might seem to be remedial, but we need to be collecting data on these and evaluating if they represent enduring opportunities. And so I'll give you a few examples of these. Margot did a great presentation just now on working from home and how to be more productive doing so. And a lot of companies are being forced to adapt work from home policies. Some of them had this in place already, but in many cases it was used rarely or only for emergencies. But we've had for a while now the technology to support this. And I wonder, once work from home is no longer mandatory, we should really evaluate if this is something that we should expand on a permanent basis. I mean, it's a measure that can provide flexibility, and ultimately that can help you retain talent. So I'd like to share some numbers from a 2019 study on the productivity of remote employees. So this is before, obviously, all of the chaos of recent, but it is a study no longer than a year old. And after the talk, I'll make sure I post a link in the chat. There were some interesting results here, and I want to share a few of the points because definitely I heard from some folks saying that they were worried about a steep drop in productivity, and indeed the options that people selected in our poll earlier, just not having people in the office together. So one of the things this study found is that for people in an office setting, the average daily amount of unproductive time, not including lunch and breaks, was 37 minutes. So it's 37 minutes if you work in an office. Can anyone take a guess what the average amount of unproductive time was for people working remotely or from home?
We're getting 15,
we're getting some answers. It's a 15,
7 minutes.
So it was actually 27 minutes. So it was a little bit, but you probably all caught where I was going with this. The people that worked from home were actually, at least according to this metric, more productive or wasted less time on average than the people that worked in the office. 39% of employees, when they worked from home, found ways to avoid working when screen time or mouse movement was being tracked. Okay. Any idea what that number was for in-office staff? %. It's not 100. No, but it's 56%. So it's actually significantly higher, the people that were finding ways to avoid working when they were in the office. And there's some other results that I found less surprising, but that illustrated that, maybe this is, that whole idea that working from home is less productive, it might not necessarily be true. Remote staff spent 29 minutes a day discussing non-work related activities with coworkers versus 66% for those that were in the office. Remote staff averaged 1.4 more working days per month than those that worked at the office. So, I'm not sure what the methodology was of this study. I can't vouch for it, but I think the results are interesting, if nothing else, to challenge conventional wisdom. And like I said, whenever I see a study like that, I always encourage different companies to track their own data. See if this works for your specific sample size, because every employee set is different. There are people that work. We saw at the beginning of Margot's talk. There are people that work really well from home. There are people who work really well from an office. We should be collecting data on this while we're all, sort of forced into this model, to see if it's something that maybe we should keep up with, even on a go-forward basis. Now, I understand that not everyone can work from home, right? There are some businesses that have had to close up shop completely. But a lot of those businesses are pursuing models that they would have never considered before. So if this describes you, think about whether this is also an opportunity for something that can continue going forward. A lot of restaurants, for example, are offering takeout and delivery where they never did before. They're doing so out of necessity, but maybe that is a new revenue stream for them going forward. They should be gathering data, looking at how profitable it is. Don't automatically abandon those measures that you're taking just because you're able to open your doors again. And the last example of this I'm actually going to cite is right here at Venture Cafe. This is a great example of an organization that has found an opportunity not only to remain relevant in the near term, but potentially to cater to a wider audience on a permanent basis. We were talking about this before Margot's presentation. These virtual events are being conducted with something like 9 other venture cafes around the globe, really. And so, if you're tired of listening to me talk, you can jump into Philadelphia or somewhere else and see if there's a more interesting topic there. It's a great opportunity for all of the different venture, I like to call them franchises, but for all of the different parts of the venture cafe universe to be able to collaborate and to reach a wider audience. You know what I mean? I know that the Providence staff are gathering data on this. I know that, this is something that's necessary in the near term, but it might not be a temporary measure. This is something that could really help the organization going forward. Find things like that you're doing in your business now, and you think you're doing it out of necessity, or that it's just this remedial fix, and see if it's something that maybe should be a long-term solution. So those are my 5 tips, and what I want to leave you with is something that's really not at all related to data, but it's something that occurred to me earlier this week as apropos of our current reality. I'm sure at least some of you have read Good to Great by Jim Collins. If you haven't, it's a study of some of the more successful companies of the last part of the 20th century. I really like it because it's so data-driven and evidence-based, but basically what he does is he looks at a number of companies that outperformed their competitors and tries to find common elements that helped them to become great. And there's a chapter in the book that deals with something called the Stockdale Paradox, okay? So you may or may not remember Admiral James Stockdale, probably most famously Ross Perot's vice presidential candidate back in the 90s. He thrust himself into the zeitgeist in a debate by saying, "Who am I? Why am I here?" But before that, Admiral Stockdale was a prisoner of war. He served in Vietnam, and he was a prisoner at the Hanoi Hilton, same place that John McCain was a POW. And when he was asked how he was able to navigate the dismal conditions of the camp, he conceptualized what Jim Collins would refer to as the Stockdale Paradox. And that is that you need to be constantly mindful of 2 seemingly competing concepts. You must confront the brutal facts of your current reality, and at the same time, you need to retain an unwavering faith that you'll not only survive, but prevail. Stockdale survived the POW camp. You know, he kept himself sane. He was a leader there that kept some of his fellow prisoners sane at the same time. So, you know, I look at that and I say, look, the facts are brutal right now, but we can survive by confronting them head on with an unwavering faith that will prevail. So I'd like to thank you for listening. I think I'm almost up at my time, but I know that Avi's probably going to establish a breakout room if anyone wants to talk more.